Hello and welcome to UnHerd. I'm Freddie Sayers. New campaign groups like Enough is Enough and Don't Pay here in the UK seem to be gathering momentum. Energy prices are spiralling far beyond affordability. There are strikes, transport and rail companies in particular. On the London Underground, millions of people walk straight past signs and posters requesting that they wear a face mask, and yet almost nobody does. Abroad, the Gilets jaunes in France, the farmers in Holland, the Canadian truckers are all groups organising against the state. And if we believe the analysts, it's all going to get worse this winter before it gets better. So, are we entering into a new era? Perhaps not of revolution, but of mass civil disobedience. One writer and activist who thinks the answer to that question is yes is Thomas Fazi. He wrote a powerful article recently for UnHerd entitled Civil Disobedience is Coming. Is he right? He joins us from Rome, Italy. Welcome, Thomas.
Hi, Freddie.
So I'm going to just start off straight away by seeing if you can sketch a scenario for us and see if we can find it plausible enough that some sort of civil disobedience might be coming down the track. What needs to happen for that to become a possibility?
It's hard to say what the breaking point of Western citizens has become. I've been expecting things to boil up for quite some time, and now and again you see something that seems to be gaining momentum, and then it kind of fizzles out. So it seems like the threshold of Western citizens, their capacity to withstand worsening living conditions, has definitely grown over the years. So on the one hand, we clearly, we've seen material conditions of Western citizens, of the overwhelming majority of Western citizens, of Western workers, deteriorate over the past decades. But at the same time, we've also seen sort of a rising apathy in Western societies. And so the two things, the question is, what's the breaking point? I think we might be nearing that point. I mean, we do seem to be kind of on the verge of a kind of perfect storm. Some people call it poly-crisis. So we have clearly the economic crisis. We've got a working crisis where we know that wages have been flatlining, if not falling, for decades, and now they're literally falling off a cliff as a result of inflation. We've got the energy crisis. We've got the green transition crisis, where government's attempts to force people to wane off, and especially force producers to wane off fossil fuel, are having very dire consequences. And of course, we have, a series of military crises quite close to home. And the situation is very, I think, quite dear. And my impression is that Western leaders do seem to have lost control of the situation. Either they're completely inane, and so they sleepwalked into this crisis. So they had, they couldn't see what they were, where they were heading for, which would make them, just completely inane. Or this is actually their, and some, more conspiracy minded people would say that this is the intended outcome, and I won't take a position on that. But, either scenarios are pretty dire in terms of how do we get out of this? Because clearly our leaders, either they have no idea how to get out of the situation or they don't want to get out of it. Because at the end of the day, we're not all in this together. As in a financial crisis, as during a COVID crisis, a lot of people are suffering and will be suffering, but a select group of people are not suffering at all, are in fact making a killing, for example, throughout this energy crisis. So the question is, who do our leaders respond to? The people or the big corporations that have put them there, and who are reaping huge profits from the current crisis. So when we talk of crisis or crises, I think it's always important to keep in mind that, it's never a crisis for everyone.
So who are the people benefiting then? I mean, you're casting this, which is quite a claim that actually all of these difficult things happening are not affecting us all. In some way, part of society is benefiting from it. And there's the insinuation they might even be furthering it deliberately. Who are these people? Who's benefiting from all of these bad things?
Well, I mean, it's the usual suspects. I mean, if we look at if we take COVID, we know that the lockdowns, the COVID measures, they caused immense harm to most citizens. They caused immense harm to small and medium businesses, but they allowed big tech, big pharma companies to reap in billions, tens of billions in profits, and to acquire, even more power than they already had. So clearly, throughout that crisis, we had losers and winners. If we look at the current crisis, it's exactly the same. In this case, we're not talking about big tech and we're not talking about big pharma. We're talking about big oil, big energy, big gas. For all this talk of the energy price increases, I think there's little understanding of exactly what is the root cause of these energy price increases. I mean, I would assume that most people think that maybe Putin has now raised prices by 5, 6, 7 times, and that's why we're paying so much more. But that's in fact not the case. If we look at the price of imported gas, so that's the actual price of gas, what big energy companies are paying for gas, it's hardly risen at all over the past year, and it's doubled over the past year and a few months. So supply and demand does play a role there. We know that the Russian supply has decreased a bit, but that accounts for a very small percentage of the price increase. So we have this small increase in the price of gas. So what the big energy companies are paying for the gas, and then we have the virtual price of gas, the price that's traded on financial markets, and which is what the wholesale price, because of the weird structures that we self-imposed upon ourselves, are based on, that have increased 1,000% more or less over the past year. So that's what accounts for the overwhelming majority of the price increase. It's financial speculation, and that explains why the big energy companies are reaping in record profits. If energy companies were paying the gas more and then just passing on the increased price to households and businesses, they wouldn't be making these huge profits. I mean, they'd be.
It's to do with, you're talking about futures and the kind of future price, because you see these charts of what is, you can buy oil or gas, as it were, a year from now. And so a lot of those very, very large increases are what people think is going to happen. Right. So in a sense, it's a model. It's a forecast. It's a panic, or it's maybe justified, but it's a forecast.
Yes, but it's not just a forecast, because we've in the European Union, for example, the price of wholesale energy is linked to the TTF in Amsterdam. So we have linked the price of wholesale energies to the prices of energy on these virtual markets. So that's part of the whole process of free marketization, liberalization will allow markets to fix the price of gas, because markets are more efficient at pricing things, and that will deliver more efficiency and lower prices for everyone. And in fact, it's the opposite. So the madness of the situation that we've put ourselves in is that we've institutionalized speculation. So wholesale prices are literally institutionally tied to these virtual markets. That's crazy. So in the European Union, for example, up until a decade ago, more or less, the wholesale prices were based on long-term contracts between importers and exporters of gas, and a lot of the gas that's being imported is still based on these long-term contracts, and that's why a lot of these companies aren't paying the gas much more than they were paying it, for example, a year ago. So actually, what we're going through is we're suffering the consequences of really the kind of crazy hyper neoliberal model that we've adopted in the West. So it's this hyper financialized model, hyper marketized model, where essentially we've allowed financial markets, speculative markets, to decide the price of gas that we end up paying, that we consumers end up paying. That's absolutely mad.
Take us from that then to civil disobedience. That's the question I opened with. I just want to try and get there first. So there's some intrinsic unfairnesses in the system some people, as you put it, are benefiting from this crisis. Your suggestion is there will come a point where ordinary people won't put up with it any longer. And certainly some of the movements we've seen here in the UK, there's one called Don't Pay, which has got hundreds of thousands of people to sign a petition saying they will just literally stop paying their energy bills. I don't know how much of that will actually happen, but you think we could get there?
Absolutely. I mean, at some point, as I said, you will reach breaking point. I mean, there is a point where when enough people aren't able to pay their bills and simply aren't able to feed themselves, to feed their families as a result of the increasing cost of living, I would say, but I would also hope that people would get very mad and either resort to civil disobedience measures such as the Don't Pay campaign, or actually take to the streets. I mean, I think that would be I would think that would be inevitable in some respect, and I would think it would also be welcome. I think, as I was saying, one of the problems in our societies is the apathy of our societies. I mean, our leaders are able to do what they do because they think they can get away with anything. And so I would say that, a bit of civil disobedience, but hey, maybe even a bit more than that. Maybe a bit of unrest in the streets, maybe a bit of rioting wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, we tend to.
I'm gonna stop short of calling for rioting, Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
But I hear what you're saying. You want to see more action. You want to see the what you perceive as these injustices turn to some kind of movement that will hold the powerful to account. What are you going to ask them to do, though? I mean, this is often the question with these movements, isn't it? Even as far back as the turn of the last millennium kind of era, there's been these big global movements, and then you ask people what they actually want to happen, and then we're on weaker territory. What would you want governments to do?
Well, I mean, there's a lot governments could do. I think one of the reasons why people tend to be apathetic is because they've internalized the idea that there's really no alternative. There's not much we can do, for example, about higher prices. Oh, you got the war in Ukraine, and of course prices are going up. It's the bastard of Putin that's shutting off the supply or raising the prices, and what are you going to do about that? As I mentioned, that's not the case at all. There's really, governments could bring prices down tomorrow. All they would have to do, for example, is first of all, let me look at the solutions that governments are proposing, that, for example, the UK government is proposing at the moment. So, so they're saying wholesale prices X, it's gone up 5, 6, 7 times. That's what the energy companies are charging the utility companies. We can't allow the utility companies to charge those prices to citizens. And so what we'll do is that we'll cap the price a bit lower than that, and we'll cover the difference between the actual wholesale price and the price cap to help the utility companies, because otherwise they would go bankrupt, because we can't allow them to pass on the entire price increase to citizens. And of course, in some respect, that's good, in the sense that citizens will be paying a bit less than they would actually end up paying if the government didn't intervene. But what you're doing is you're actually you're subsidizing the big energy companies. So you're bailing out the utility companies, and you're essentially subsidizing the big energy companies. So through your price structure, you're saying, I'm allowing the energy companies to price the energy 10. And then, if utility companies can't afford to buy the energy for that price, I will cover up the difference. I mean, this is literally socialism for corporations. So there's really no other way to put it. I mean, this is a massive scam. What governments could and should do in the immediate future is go to these big energy companies and ask them, how much are you paying the gas? No, show me the numbers. I want to see how much you're paying the gas. Interestingly, that's a state, that's a company secret in a lot of cases. We have some organizations in Italy that have tried to figure out how much so that's a part state-owned energy company, which has increased prices by almost tenfold, and including the energy minister has actually tried to figure out how much is Eni paying the gas. Simple question. How much are you paying the gas from Russia? We don't know because they won't open up their books. So that's the first, but that's of course the government just accepting no for an answer. We're forgetting how powerful governments potentially are. So they could go to energy companies tomorrow and say, okay, if that's what you're paying, we're going to buy it for the same price. You're not even going to make a profit on that because you've been making huge profits just over the past year, So if I feel kind, I'll leave those profits to you, but you're not going to make more profits for the next year. Just give us the energy for the price you're paying it. That's something that potentially governments could do. These energy prices are set by governments, by authorities. We tend to forget that. In the European Union, these prices are basically set by the European Commission. And as I mentioned earlier, they are linked to these virtual trading markets. So first of all, stop tying the price of gas to these speculative financial activities, go to the energy companies and just tell them, we are going to pay the gas, whatever you're paying for it. And you're not even going to make a profit because you made quite enough money in the past year. And of course, the next obvious step would be to ask ourselves, does it make sense to keep bailing out at a huge public cost these utility companies, which are essentially bankrupt, which can't be on the market without continuous state support? So we've privatized these companies, thinking that would bring efficiency and lower public costs. And now we find ourselves having to essentially, extend continuous lifelines to these companies. What's the point of keeping them private? Start by nationalizing the utility companies, the energy providers, and then and the second step would be, in my opinion, to nationalize the big oil companies too, the big energy companies. I can see no rationale, especially in the current context, for leaving what is the lifeblood of our economies, energy, in the hands of for-profit mega corporations that don't have the public interest at heart. And look, of course, they don't have the workers' interests at heart, but they don't have the national interest of countries at heart. I would say, this is why I think this is something that should cut through the left-right divide. We've reached a point where this is not about, left or right. It's not about, it's not just a problem affecting ordinary citizens, affecting workers or low-income people. This is affecting, the entire economy, the entire Western economic system. So I would say nationalizing these companies has become a question of national security. So, the demands are pretty simple, in my opinion. Of course, people first have to be helped understanding what the problem is. And of course, our mainstream media doesn't help in this regard. It keeps muddling the waters. People don't understand what the root causes of this poly-crisis are. And I would say, it boils down to the kind of, market-based neoliberal model that we have adopted in the past few decades.
So my guess here, I can't speak for the viewers, but my guess is that most people would agree with a big part of your analysis of the problems, and that there's been a whole lot of incompetence that have led us to this kind of moment, and something big needs to happen. Where you start losing people will be in the prescribed solution, because more state involvement in things like energy companies, going around nationalizing everything, may sound like an easy fix, but a lot of people are actually very anxious about countries owning more and more of the things that control their lives. There's a lot of people anxious about national digital currencies where they can turn on and off your paycheck and decide how you spend it. The idea that your government might also own your gas company and turn you on and off depending on whether you've been, behaving well will probably freak a lot of people out. So are you sure that's the direction?
I totally understand why people would think that, especially coming from the disastrous management of COVID. A lot of people have started to see the state as the number one enemy. That's completely understandable. as you know, I have criticized COVID policies in very strong terms. So the question is not defending what the government has done throughout COVID or before, or what it's doing now. I would say the issue boils down to at the moment the state seems to be bent on controlling citizens, controlling people, and giving capital, especially big capital, free rein. So this, I would say, is more or less the direction we're heading in. This would be my kind of description of neoliberalism. So it's not a small state model. That's based on really fallacious views of what neoliberalism is all about. It's not about small state and free markets. It's about using the state to essentially empower big corporations and let them get away with pretty much everything they want to do. It's about creating institutional paradigms where big capital can pretty much do whatever it wants with the aid of the state. So, for example, during COVID, we saw the state helping big pharma make billions through its vaccine mandates. So, the state and big capital work hand in hand. But, it's about deregulating big capital while increasing control of citizens, while increasing control of the everyday life of ordinary people. So I would say we have to turn that paradigm on its head. So I would say what we need is a system where the state thoroughly controls big capital, puts a rein on big capital, while at the same time increasing the freedom and the autonomy of people. But of course, that also means giving them, putting them in an economic situation where they can pursue their dreams, where they can fulfill their dreams. In the current system, when someone can't pay their energy bills, in what sense are they free? They're not free. So they might be free in a purely formal sense. So I would say creating the material conditions for people to be able to fulfill themselves should be the state's mission. And I think, but the only way to do that is to rein in big capital, because big capital is ultimately what has been basically sucking wealth from workers, from low-income people, from the lowest strata of society up to the highest strata of society.
Maybe crony capitalism is a more useful
Absolutely.
phrase than the neoliberalism here. But that sounds what you're talking about. And I think you're right that people on the right and the left would agree that there has been a lot of that recently, kind of states supporting these big international corporations and their kind of technocratic bargain by which those things have been taken out of the democratic sphere. Where I would probably push back, though, is the idea that the crises that we're facing at the moment helps those people. Because if you're a technocrat or the CEO of a big corporation, what you really want is the whole machine to be humming along nicely. You don't like ups and downs. You don't like political crises. You don't like people like you going on YouTube channels and talking about the need for civil disobedience. What you want is quiet. That's where profits are most reliably made. So I don't think these people you're talking about, with access to big international capital, are laughing at the moment. I think it's quite an unsettling time for them because net, yes, there might be some companies that have made big profits during these turbulent times, but net, it's been negative for big corporations. And the current energy crisis throws up the chance of, as you say, even the British Conservatives, you would probably call them a neoliberal party. They're talking about, big sudden taxes on energy companies, windfall taxes, or maybe there'll be price caps, maybe there'll be something else. If you're a CEO, it's not a great environment. What do you say to that?
Well, I would disagree that things have been bad for big capital. We witnessed an increased concentration of wealth at the higher echelons of the of the Western pyramid, and that's a fact. Again, it's about winners and losers. It's about who is really pulling the strings. a lot of companies clearly throughout COVID, as I mentioned earlier, and even now will go under. But then they are not the ones. It's not, this molecular kind of capitalism made of thousands of small and medium enterprises that are actually influencing government. It's the largest corporations. What was I reading just now? That so now they're it looks like the biggest the biggest British companies are likely to British electricity industry may make 170 billion pounds in excess profits. Now, I think that's hard to frame as a bad situation for these people. So I think we really have to understand. I think that it's these it's these new industrial complexes that are incredibly powerful, that do benefit from these crises. They benefited from COVID, and now they're benefiting from the energy crisis. That's kind of the point that I was making in the article. I mean, it's not about labor versus capital anymore. I would say it's about labor plus small capital plus medium capital versus big capital. So now you have this this extremely concentrated wealth and power that holds huge influence over governments, and actually does benefit from situations that make that make all the rest of us worse overall. So I would disagree with that. I think we've entered a phase of what Naomi Klein would call. We have entered for quite some time a phase of what Naomi Klein would call disaster capitalism, or you could call it emergency capitalism or crisis capitalism. I mean, you seem to reason in terms of almost a post-war settlement, where it was a system where capital tried to reach a compromise with labor to the extent that as long as if everyone's happy, the system's running, we're making profits, and you guys are earning decent wages, everyone's happy, but we're also making a profit. But that system broke down a long time ago, so that's not the kind of capitalism that we are in today. I would be very happy. I mean, as we transition to the kind of socialist paradise that I dream for, I would be more than happy to go back to the kind of post-war settlement. But I don't see it very likely in the medium short term because this, what you could call this hyper capital, has become completely disconnected from the rest of the economic system. And it often actually benefits from situations that make the rest of the system worse off. That's why I spoke of in the article the kind of self-cannibalization of Western capital. I mean, we have to wrestle our societies free from these mega corporations that I really do consider, and of course that includes huge financial corporations that exert huge influence over the entire economy. They are, of course, the same, the usual suspects that are, again, making huge profits from this energy crisis. It's not just the energy companies, it's the traders, it's the big banks. So it's always so these people are benefiting hugely from this situation that risks, literally killing potentially thousands of people this winter.
Let's talk about people's reaction a little bit, because that's what we started off talking about. And it is very interesting, this idea that people are more acquiescent or more just happy to go along with a system, even though they know that it's not really working for them. The 70s is an era where we think about there being a lot of protests. The 60s, there were protests of a different kind. There have been less successful protest movements since then. What's your diagnosis of that? Why do you think people have sort of zoned out of the idea of insisting on political change?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, of course, one reason is the death of the kind of more labor-based radical or socialist left. I mean, there's none of that really anymore in Western societies, and when it comes to kind of the economic paradigm, labor, social democratic, center-left parties are almost indistinguishable from conservative or center-right parties. So the kind of the convergence of what historically were the two major kind of political families in the first half in the second half of the 20th century. That's clearly part of the problem. People realize that voting doesn't make that much of a difference anymore. And of course, this process of depoliticization also includes, for example, shifting power and responsibilities to these kind of supranational institutions which aren't accountable to people. The European Union clearly played a big role in the European context in this respect, making people feel even further away from where the decisions are actually taken, which is true, which is one of the reasons why I supported Brexit. At least it makes politicians, potentially more accountable to citizens, even though that hasn't worked out that well so much for now. But it does create a framework where they are potentially more accountable to citizens. And then you have wider kind of anthropological changes. The increased digitalization, I think, of life also has to do with that. It's really a myriad of factors.
I think a lot of people would agree with some of those factors, but don't they add up to this rather sleepy population? I think both you and I were surprised during COVID how much people were prepared to take. And I guess I began to think that there was something quite attractive to a lot of people about a slightly sleepier way of life. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put up with it. And you're getting quite deep and quite sort of existential, philosophical here, but it's less energetic. It's less hard work. It's less scary if you have less choice. And if you live in a world where the parameters are sort of set for you by powers that you can't even see and have no power to change, all you can do is kind of go about your day in a smaller, more constrained kind of way. And I wonder whether there is something kind of weirdly soporific about that, something that people almost find hard to want to shrug off because it's just too much effort. Do you see where I'm getting at?
Obviously. I mean, I think a lot of people will relate to what you're saying. That's the result of everything I mentioned, and probably a host of other things that we don't have time to get in. That is definitely where we're at. I mean, Western citizens are more apathetic than they've probably ever been throughout history. I mean, that's a fact. But of course, people also need to eat. So I think the question is, what's kept the system going has been the ability, despite worsening living conditions, despite everything, we're still going to, chances are, masses of people aren't going to go hungry. People are still going to be able to heat and light their homes, and you're still going to be able to buy cheap shit from China, even though you're earning a pittance. That's kind of been the neoliberal compromise. We'll give you the kind of bare minimum to survive while we keep amassing, unconscionable riches on your back.
Which is why potentially this winter, or potentially in the next year, if just today we're reading about small businesses that are going to fold because of energy prices. Venues, places like pubs in the UK, they've already had a terrible time of it because of the COVID policies. Now face a whole new challenge, which is keeping open during this period. Maybe that changes it. Is that what you're saying? That maybe the sort of sleepiness that we have become used to observing might just end, and people might just say enough is enough as the movement goes?
Well, I think that's a very real possibility. And as I mentioned earlier, okay, we're not going to go as far as to argue for riots, but I would say that would also be the sign that of a healthy society. I mean, the kind of an instinctual, even a very instinctive reaction to a perceived injustice. I say it's a sign of a healthy society. So I would say that in the face of that, I would think it would be perfectly natural for people to react. As I said, much of the acquiescence has been based on the ability to provide basic material, conditions for people. If the system isn't able to provide that anymore, then I think the whole, the house of cards does come crashing down. And of course, one way to taper over it, once again, would be to, just give money to people. That's one possible solution. That's kind of how they muddle through COVID.
Keeps people quiet in a way handing out, well, in the UK it was something in the region of £250 billion, the COVID policies cost. Handing out that or redistributing that through borrowing ultimately was how people were kept quiet. But that doesn't seem to be a great long-term solution to this.
Absolutely. So if it's not, so if the system doesn't break down, honestly, I mean, if it doesn't break down this winter, that you're just chucking the can down the road, in my opinion, because we're realizing more and more that Western power has been based on finance. I mean, I won't go into the details, but I would disagree with the term borrowing. The UK government just created that money out of thin air. It borrowed it from itself. It borrowed it from the Bank of England, which is part of the state. So so there are no financial constraints in the short term. I mean, especially big, powerful, advanced countries can create a lot of money without too serious consequences in the short term, especially not inflation. And the inflation we're witnessing now doesn't have to do with that. But I think we're increasingly understanding that actual real resources, real stuff, is actually more important than ones and zeros on a computer, which is what financial power is made of. Ultimately, it's basically electronic money, and we've based our power on electronic money for so long, and of course that has been bolstered by the United States and the power of the dollar. But that system is coming down, and we're realizing that so much of the stuff we actually need to live comes from abroad. We have to actually buy it with these ones and zeros, but which are literally ones and zeros. And I think when things turn sour, the country that has the raw materials, even if it might have a much smaller GDP, actually ends up being in a much better position than a country that doesn't have the essential raw materials but has lots of ones and zeros on a computer.
So for you, this moment is tied up with a kind of deglobalization initiative. Then you want to see countries, individual nations being more self-sufficient, producing their own energy, producing their own food, producing their own goods more. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that would be good for the environment, since everyone's talking about going green. That would be we know how much global trade contributes to pollution and to CO2 emissions, if one is worried about that. But I think it would also make for greater geopolitical security. I mean, we thought that making countries increasingly dependent from each other would promote security and world peace, and in fact, we're figuring out that that's not exactly how it works. It can actually promote insecurity. And so I think moving towards greater self-sufficiency would definitely be in the interest of individual countries and world peace in general. And again, that's not an impossible, and that doesn't mean going completely autarkic, but it does mean, as Keynes said, making what you can do at home, you should try and do at home, and especially finance, as Keynes used to stress, should be national. So that means, of course, returning to a system, again, reining in global capital. But again, if we look at energy, we're talking so much about, the energy crisis, and we do have potentially a solution that can make every country largely self-sufficient, and that, of course, is nuclear energy.
Let me take us back, Thomas. Sorry to interrupt there, but let me take us back to this idea of civil disobedience, because in a sense, that's what might trigger some kind of reaction or some kind of bigger change. Until people decide they're fed up with it, the current system will basically roll on. What is so interesting is how these movements are tied at the moment to a kind of moral imperative. And that really helps get people on board. So, for example, you have a country like Germany, the industrial powerhouse of Europe, asking its citizens to consume less energy, dramatically less energy, to, first of all, help the environment, but also help the Ukrainian effort, because it's seen as doing their bit to reduce the power of Putin to punish them. So there's this kind of moral pressure that now goes with these things. And so far, it looks like the people of Germany are going along with it. There are efforts to reduce energy consumption. How do you tackle that? I think the same is happening in the UK and probably in Italy where you are. how can you sort of reframe the debate so you don't feel like if you reject this, you're actually on the side of the baddies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I would say in very general terms, the way you reframe it is that that's just justifying class war, and that's what ruling elites always do. So after the financial crisis, it was our moral imperative to cut back on welfare expenditure, on social services, on hospital spending, for the greater good, because there is no more money, which was, of course, bullshit, because we know that, as I mentioned earlier, the state was meantime creating hundreds of billions of pounds, dollars, euros, and giving it away to banks. Then we saw the same thing happening during COVID, where we were told it was our moral imperative to shut ourselves in our homes, to keep our kids away from school, to go through these ridiculous rituals in the name of the collective good, which we know was not served by those measures. Again, we know who those measures served, mainly the big pharma and big tech corporations that made a killing thanks to those lockdown and associated measures. And now we're told once again that it's our moral imperative to put our lights off and have cold showers and so on. That's just putting a nice spin on what is class war, on what is making.
Well, so what should we do then? Should we turn the showers up? We turn all the lights on around the house. What is that? Civil disobedience?
In the short term, that makes no difference whatsoever. I mean, that's not going to make any any impact overall, on the prices or on the. I mean.
So what should we do, Thomas? Let's give you the pulpit here. What should we do? What is the Thomas Fazi recommendation to people who are frustrated with the system? They're not probably gonna support some kind of revolution, but they want to make their voices heard. What do you recommend?
Well, first of all, I would say what is needed is collective action. Again, this is this kind of neoliberal approach, where it's all about the individual. So it's all about, if you turn the lights off a bit, you're saving the world. That's bullshit. That's not going to help anything. It's not going to help the Ukrainians. It's not going to help the Russian citizens that, might want to get rid of Putin. And it definitely doesn't help the poorest and most disadvantaged people here in Europe or in the West more in general. What is needed is not these individualized solutions. It's collective action. And as you said, that means, turning up the heat on our leaders. And that could be through, for example, civil disobedience measures as, not paying the bills. More traditionally, it might mean taking to the streets, picketing, protesting. But I mean, at some point, it's understanding that until we make our voices heard, as you mentioned, things are not likely to change. And because that's also part of the problem we're living in terms of Western political elites. You censored me when I was starting to advocate rioting earlier, but I think what I was trying to get to is that there's something. I mean, even those in power. I mean, there has to be some feedback between the lower rungs of society and the higher rungs of society and the political system. There has to be some feedback. If that feedback breaks down, then you don't live in a democratic system anymore, regardless of whether you can vote every X years. So, getting some of that feedback back into the system, which does also mean taking angrily to the streets. If you think, if you're pissed off about not being able to heat your home or to feed your family. And honestly, I mean, I think, I spoke to my mother earlier. She lives in Norwich. She's 70, and she was seriously concerned about whether she's going to be able to afford heating this winter, or if she's going to have to lie in bed under her covers for the entire winter. And that that saddens me, and it angers me. And it saddens and angers me to know that potentially millions of people are having those thoughts at the moment. And I think it's only fair that those people, kind of try to forge and unite and coalesce their energies and their anger, and their anger because they should be angry. And of course, there's also a lack of people telling citizens that they should be angry.
Do you think
there's no one out there.
Thomas, do you think it can be done still at the ballot box? I mean, you're talking to us from Italy. We're in the middle of a kind of potential new political era in Italy. If Giorgia Meloni becomes the new prime minister, that's kind of a big deal because she's from a party that was considered fringe, extreme until very recently. She's not a big fan of the European Union, although, as far as I know, she's not actually planning to take Italy out of it. Are we going to see, do you think, in Italy, an example of how people can actually vote at the ballot box to create change and they don't need to think of new types of revolution?
Well, I mean, I think Italy is a different case from the UK, as I've written countless times on UnHerd. I mean, Euro countries are in a very specific situation where, that basically governments have almost no economic autonomy whatsoever, and so they lack the kind of levers that would be needed to solve any of these problems, whether it be nationalizing companies or even just printing money. That's something that Italy can't do. So when it comes to
because
Italy,
it's in the EU,
because it's decided at EU level. So in a Euro country, especially in a kind of peripheral Euro country like Italy, voting, when it comes to the major, issues that affect our everyday lives, our major economic and social issues, has become largely unconsequential. So Meloni might, be able to intervene in areas such as immigration or more kind of cultural things, but when it comes to actual economic decisions, Meloni has almost no power whatsoever. So Italy is definitely not a good example to advocate for, change through the ballot box. I would say what we can still consider, a relatively sovereign country, definitely a monetarily sovereign country like the UK, then, the situation is different because a government potentially a different government would have potentially the means to enact a lot of the measures that we spoke about earlier. I mean, it could do it, I mean, it has the financial firepower and it has the kind of legal firepower to pretty much do whatever it wants. So it could bring the energy companies under public control. It could create the money necessary to do that, and so on and so forth. So potentially yes, but the question is that you have to get there on the back of that. I would say that's the ballot box should be the kind of endpoint of a longer process. You get to the ballot the ballot box, after you've created a situation in society where enough people want change, and then we'll ask for change in the ballot box. If you don't have all that beforehand, then you just end up choosing a different version of what you had before. So I think the kind of grassroots aspect of it is incredibly important. That's why I would say, in the midst of this situation, there is hope. Insofar as this situation might kind of be what sparks people to leave the comfort of their homes and rediscover even the joy, I would say, of collective grassroots political action, because it can be very invigorating to see that when you're a sufficient number of people and you're sufficiently scary to the people in power, you can actually obtain things that you would have thought impossible.
Let me ask, as a kind of final question, whether there is any element of careful what you wish for here, because what we've seen during the COVID era is that administrations that consider themselves liberal can be really quite repressive if necessary, if they feel like the alternative argument is too existential for them to face. And I wonder what would happen in a liberal Western country if there was a very sincere, very powerful opposition movement. Do you think we might even see repression instead of change?
Definitely. Oh, I think you're also going to see repression. That's part of every movement for change, and you don't have to come up with imagine scenarios. I mean, just look at, for example, how the the Yellow Vest movement in France was repressed by Macron. So we have, we know how these governments react to mass movements. We saw how these governments reacted to the anti-lockdown protests in a number of countries very violently, in a very repressive manner. So yes,
the Canadian truckers' bank accounts were frozen.
That's even more dystopian what they did in that case. So of course we are going to witness repression, but we are in the middle. But this is part of finding, I think, a new. We really need to find a new consensus. The West really needs to reinvent itself, and it's not going to reinvent itself without some degree of turbulence. I think that's part of what it's like. It's growing pains. It's part of growing up. And I think Western societies do need to grow up. They need to evolve into something different from what they've become, and that will involve a period of turbulence. That's for sure. There's going to be repression. There's also going to be victories on both sides. It's where I think we might be witnessing the beginning of this process of change, which is going to be long and difficult and hard. But I would say. The alternative is almost is worse, I would say, by almost any definition, because you're simply postponing all of these problems just further down the road. So I think we have to be ready for the change that's coming, and that's it's scary, but it can also be I would say exciting. Absolutely.
Thomas Fazi, thank you. With those rousing and somewhat unsettling words, we are going to have to call it a day, but thank you for your thoughts today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, there you have it. That was Thomas Fazi, UnHerd columnist, filmmaker, activist, making the case for some kind of collective action, non-compliance, civil disobedience, to make the point to whoever is listening that the system we are governed in is no longer working. My guess is that some people will be inspired, others may be kind of terrified and wary of civil unrest of any kind. We will see how bad it gets this winter and which of these groups wins out. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.